Hey, what's up YouTube? Today we're going to talk about build versus buy for your technology stack. So when you are in a position of leadership in technology, you're often going to be asked about whether or not your team should build something from scratch so that you own the entire bit of technology and you also don't have licensing costs, or if you should buy it. So we need to talk about how you should make that decision, what you should prepare, how you should look at it. Now, I've been asked to do this multiple times, and every time it's a little bit different. But here are the common pieces. So you need to understand first what it really costs you to build it so that you have a place of comparison. You need to understand whether or not, first, your team can build it. Do you have the right skills? If you don't have the right skills, where are you going to get them? Do you need to hire? How long is that going to take? How much does it cost to recruit certain engineers? How long will it take to recruit certain engineers? Because that's going to affect your timeline. Also, if you can't recruit them very quickly, could you hire contractors? And it may make sense to hire contractors if you realize when you're kind of looking through this thing that you're going to need most of the team only for, say, 6 months or a year, and then you're just not going to have the same amount of work. So then it may make sense to just hire contractors because that doesn't really make sense for full-time employees. And then when you have some idea of both how much it will cost to build in terms of salaries, recruitment costs, hosting costs, cloud costs, things like that, you can then look at buying. And then you're looking also at time to market. So even if you buy software, it's going to take time to negotiate that deal, pay for the software, get it, and integrate it with the rest of your systems. So then you have kind of two timelines. The timelines to build it, the timelines to buy and integrate it. And then you have your kind of time to market. If you look at that time to market, you could also talk to your business teams and ask them, like, well, how much is this worth? How much money do we think we're losing or not able to make or whatever for every month that we don't have this online? And you can add that to the difference in time to market, right? So if you're losing $100,000 every month because you don't have, say, some sort of customer segmentation system, then you can just say, you know what, it would take us 6 months to build it, 2 months to buy it. Therefore, it's worth $400,000 if we can buy it, this year. And then of course the next year it's a wash because you'd have it either way. That now you have some apples to apples comparisons in terms of what it would cost to create and get into production. The next thing you need to explore is what your long-term maintenance costs are. So if you buy software, you usually have ongoing license fees. Unlike building it, which may be more expensive up front, you're going to be paying that constantly and scaling up. Now, if you don't really have the skills to build it to begin with, you may also have really high maintenance costs because you have to keep hiring contractors to upgrade the system, manage it, maintain it, depending on how well built it was. And if you don't have the skills to build it at a really high quality yourself the first time, you really don't have the skills to validate that the quality of what you're building is great either way. So that's a real worry. With vendors, you have a different concern. With vendors, you need to know how that license cost is going to change over time. So a lot of times you'll have vendors who will promise you the moon to get this thing installed, but there's really no long-term guarantees about keeping license costs under control. You may sign, say, a 2 or 3 year contract, and then in 3 years, a couple things could happen. One, they might make the price go way up. Not just like 5% or 10%, but maybe 20 or 30. Because there's really nothing stopping them from doing that other than your desire to go somewhere else. But if you've spent years integrating the software and building everything on top of it, the switching costs are high, and they know that. So the next concern you have is, what if they get acquired? If you're buying startup technology, their parent company may buy them. And that may or may not be good for you. In fact, it might be horrible. So this actually happened to some companies I used to work with. I worked with a number of companies that had used Gigya, and Gigya was acquired, and also they discontinued a number of products that those companies used, and they had to scramble to find replacements. And there wasn't a whole lot that was the same fit for their needs, and they had to revamp all that software. And of course, none of that work was on their original timeline, so it just disrupted all sorts of things. So that's a real concern. Even if that company is doing great and growing and stable, they may get acquired, in fact, and still cause problems, or they may just discontinue the product. And then another thing that can happen is you can simply have startups especially go out of business. They may just decide that this isn't a market for them. Especially if you have a very niche product, then you may be their niche and there may not be a lot of other customers for them, and they may just run out of funds. So if they're a venture capital startup and they've been going for a few years and they peter out, then you're again in a place where you're going to have to very suddenly rip out and replace that software. And if you've built key functionality as part of your ecosystem on it, you could be in for a bad time and very extreme increases in costs. So what can you do either way? Well, when you install software and you integrate it with your systems, usually vendors have kind of an easy install. They want to make it so easy for you to get it in there because they know they'll have that lock-in. So they'll offer SDKs to your developers, all sorts of support, things like that. But what you'll notice is that usually their drop-in code is something that you have to add to your mobile app or whatever, and that it integrates directly with your customer. There's no barrier between that software and your end users. So if you rip it out, you are also ripping out that experience for your end users. What you can do when you integrate such software, but it comes at a cost, is basically create a buffer API, where you write your code against your API, and that API talks to this vendor. And then if you have to rip out the vendor, you can replace it with something equivalent. So instead of using, say, a cloud vendor like Amazon or Google's built-in messaging system, so they have like message queues to keep it really simple, you can have a message queue service that you have in all of your various pieces of software, and those create a common API that you then delegate all the messages to either Google PubSub or Amazon SQS or whatever, or RabbitMQ or whatever you want to use. And that way, the developer doesn't really know what it is, and if you have to rip it out, you can put something else in. But this only really works for pretty generic functionality, and if it's something very specific for that vendor, if that's their whole claim to fame, that they do this amazing magical thing that no one does, then you have a problem. And of course, every vendor is then looking for that special thing that they do, because that's how they charge a higher price in the market, that they have some unique value proposition, but also that it makes it harder for you to do exactly that. At the same time, doing that slows your time to market, so it goes back, you've got that balancing act. One of the ways that I've seen people get through this, if they decide that it really makes sense to purchase, is they may plug something in day one and just get it to market, and then they have to have the discipline to slowly replace that built-in API and those built-in SDKs that were handed to them by the vendor with something that they control. And they may do that over the next year. So they may say, you know what, we have a 1 or 2 year contract with this vendor. Sure, we'll plug it in day one, but then every sprint we'll have a ticket to replace one API call with some wrapper that we're building. It takes discipline to do that, but I have seen people do that and be successful. And then when or if something happens, they're in a position to rip out that software without as much disruption. It also helps them keep cost under control, because if they do that and the vendor knows they've done that, then when they go to the negotiating table for a re-up of that contract, the vendor knows they can be replaced. And that encourages them to cut you a deal on the price because they know you have an exit strategy. So those are the things that I would consider when doing build versus buy. The other thing to really consider, and this is a strategic choice, is whether or not what you're building is a differentiator for your business. If you are looking at building versus buying something that's pretty commodity, like content management or segmentation or any of these other things, or like a message service or things like that, there's really very little reason to build it yourself if you can find an affordable option, either open source or otherwise, to get it done. And then the rest is really just a money game and a time game. So focus your internal engineering primarily on your unique value proposition and what you bring to market that's special, and try to just get rid of these other problems as much as possible so you can focus on moving quickly, but also give yourself an out. So that's my idea about an opinion about how you should approach building versus buying for your software company.